Picture this, knights clad in shining armour, charging into battle on horseback, dual-wielding pistols, firing them both as they go, firing a carbine from their shoulder on horseback, before pulling out their sabre and charging into the midst of battle, all whilst bullets and arrows alike bounced off their armour. No, this isn't a weird Hollywood film like Cowboys vs Aliens. This was the cavalry scene in the 1600s, a time where armour and guns intersected and coexisted, a forgotten time in history, the time of knights with guns. Let me explain. In the 1600s, firearms had become more and more common, and more armies were using them, and the standard tactics had evolved into what was called shot and pike tactics, which was essentially half your men were armed with early muskets or arquebuses, early guns, they were the shot, and the other half were armed with very long spears or pikes, shot and pike. Now these units would work together, and the shot, or the musket men or the arquebus men, would be able to provide long range fire, would be able to shoot from a distance, and then when things got up close and personal, the pikemen would move in front and they would clash. Now, due to this, the idea of knights with lances and heavy cavalry clad in armour really went out of fashion. However, the armour did not. Now, this suit of armour here is from Hohensalzburg Castle in Salzburg, Austria, and it's from the mid-1600s, and it's very interesting. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was a knight's armour from the medieval time, but in fact this was almost 200 years into the Renaissance after the medieval period had ended. Now, this armour was very thick, very, very thick, and you can see that by that large dent on the breastplate there. Now, that was what was called proofing, which was the maker of the armour. When he presented it to you, when you ordered this armour and it was ready, the maker would then take his pistol and shoot it at point blank range to prove that it was bulletproof. That was called proofing the armour, hence the term bulletproof. Now, because of the thickness of said armour, as the entire suit would have been musket ball resistant up to basically point blank range, the suit of armour weighed 36 kilos, which is the same as a 10-year-old child. Now, due to this, most foot soldiers had given up on wearing armour, as unlike in the medieval times when at least chainmail would be worn by those poorer soldiers and most wealthier people would be clad in armour, against bullets that armour just wasn't cutting it, and to make it thick enough to be effective, you could barely move in the thing. So due to this heavy armour did carry on long after the invention of gunpowder, but it became relegated to mainly heavy cavalry, who, because they were on a large horse, they weren't carrying the weight. Now, that's not very nice for the horse, but for you riding, it's a lot better. And one thing the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed is that he doesn't have any lower leg armour, he's just got a pair of boots. Now, the reason for this was they figured if we're just going to be cavalry, we want as much control and feel in our feet as possible in the stirrups. So they went for these very, very tough leather boots which could resist a sword slash or even a sword stab. They couldn't resist musket fire, but the chance of it hitting your foot was relatively low, and given that the rest of you was completely impervious to musket fire, it was a sacrifice that they were willing to make. Now, these knights with guns only existed for a relatively short time, as they basically fell out of fashion, and as armies got bigger and bigger, it became more and more expensive to deck out your heavy cavalry with all of this armour, as it really cost a lot. But the basic tactics of this new heavy cavalry to work alongside the shot and pike were, instead of simply charging head on like you do, imagine the Battle of Agincourt, the famous French charge of knights with their lances, every medieval movie basically. Instead of that, you'd ride up to the enemy, but instead of charging them, you'd then turn and ride parallel to their main force. Meanwhile, you'd pull out your pistols or your carbine, which is an early type of rifle, and fire from 10 to 30 metres away, and basically pick them off. And if needs be, you could then draw your sabre and fight other cavalrymen. And this was called the carousel, where you'd basically come round and round again, and you ride alongside your enemy, shoot at them, ride off, reload, and repeat. And it was very, very effective. However, it was simply the weight and the cost of this armour that made it go out of fashion, and cavalry then started doing the same role essentially, just without the armour. Now, the English Civil War is quite an interesting example. because the royalists did actually have a force of these knights with guns, this heavy cavalry, who are nicknamed the Lobsters. And there are accounts of them being shot at point blank range, and even the pistol being put against the back of some of their helmets and fired, and they were impervious. But in battles they were generally ineffective, and there was one famous battle where they were shot numerous times, this heavy cavalry, and were absolutely fine, but then due to a tactical blunder ended up charging down a hill, and most of the heavy cavalry fell off their horse and broke their legs. So although the armour had done them very well and they were impervious to anything that could be thrown at them, they were actually vulnerable tactically. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the parliamentarians on the other side of the English Civil War had gone for the other strategy of arming themselves and protecting themselves, which was to keep a breastplate and make that bulletproof, keep a helmet, make that bulletproof, and scrap the rest of the armour in favour of mobility and it being cheaper to then arm a force of cavalry like that. And indeed, this royalist unit didn't last most of the Civil War, and the rest of the royalist cavalry went the same way with just a breastplate and a helmet. They didn't bother with the full set of armour, as it was very, very heavy and very awkward to use, but the protection was unmatched. Now, why was this armour needed? Why did it come about? And for this, we have to look at the relationship between guns and armour throughout history. Now, cannons and guns have actually been around for far longer than many people realise. The Battle of Agincourt, for instance, had cannons in it, but they were very early types which were pretty much useless, and it was the longbowmen that really won the day, as they were far more effective than these early guns. But guns were there. And later events such as the Siege of Rhodes in 1480 and in 1522 gave examples of the Knights of St. John fighting and actually being shot, and there was an example of Pierre d'Aubusson, who was leading the defence, was shot in the head by a cannonball, but due to the fact it was quite an early cannon and not the most powerful, he somehow shrugged it off. And during this fighting there was a weird mix of crossbows, bows, early arquebuses, all alongside the swords and spears, and the armour generally could stand up relatively well. And the same thing happened again at the Siege of Malta in 1565, where again the Knights of St. John against the Ottomans. There were a lot of early guns. By this point, far more. The guns had become the most prevalent thing, and this really set the tone for warfare for the future. Now, imagine you're a knight, and you spend your days charging down lines of peasants armed with spears, on horseback, clad in full armour, with your lance, with your shield. It's not a particularly safe job, but the odds are with you generally. Now, if the enemy has longbowmen, you're in trouble. However, the time it takes to train a longbowman is quite literally a lifetime. To have a skilled unit of longbowmen is very expensive and will take a long time. So many armies didn't have that, hence why heavy cavalry and knights in armour on horseback were the dominant military force all throughout the Middle Ages. However, when these guns finally became somewhat effective, it was much easier to take a group of peasants, train them how to use these firearms in a month, 2 months, and they could use them. They didn't need to have special muscles, they didn't need to have the strength and the technique that archers did. It was literally just point and shoot. It's a boomstick. And so this meant that suddenly an army of peasants could be very quickly equipped and trained and could counter knights completely. And suddenly charging this line of peasants, which wasn't safe to begin with, became a lot less appealing when you knew you could just be shot from a distance. And this is why heavy cavalry fell out of favour and why feudalism and knights really died off, because didn't want to do that. But the reason these knights with guns are so interesting, this later period in the 1600s, is because this was a case of they basically adapted to the fact they went, okay, guns around, let's just make our armour even thicker. We'll make it more efficient design so it won't cover every inch of us, but it will cover the bits it needs to, and it will be thick enough that it can stop bullets. And you have knights with guns. Now, I should caveat that they're not really knights in the same sense of we think. They weren't feudal lords, they were simply just heavy cavalry. But for all intents and purposes, on the battlefield they acted just like the knights and heavy cavalry of the past had. There were also the Polish winged hussars, who were an example of heavy cavalry that adapted but also refused to adapt at the same time. Now, the Winged Hussars became famous for their charge during the Battle of Vienna in 1683, which was the largest cavalry charge ever, where, to relieve the siege of Vienna, a joint army led by the Polish Winged Hussars charged down the hill into the Ottoman camp. Now, the Winged Hussars wore armour which was also bulletproofed, but was a lot lighter in its coverage than a lot of the heavy cavalry of the knights with guns that we have been looking at. It didn't cover every inch of them, but it was thick enough to resist musket shot. And their weaponry was very interesting. So they also rode into battle with sabres, carbines and dual pistols, but their chief weapon was the lance, which you might be thinking, well hang on, thought the lance went out of favour 100, 150 years before this. And you'd be right in thinking that, as the pike and shot warfare had dominated, the thing I mentioned earlier. But what the Polish did is they took their lance and they thought, should we leave it alone? Nah, let's make it bigger. So they hollowed it out and made the lance twice as long. Now this meant the Winged Hussars could outpike the pike. They had a longer stick than all the pikemen, and the shot aspect of the pike and shot was less effective when they're bulletproof. So they would come in these huge cavalry charges with their lances out front, and they could spear the pike and shot formations before the pikes could get them. And then they could switch to their pistols, to their sabres, to fighting like other heavy cavalry would. And this was the last true shot cavalry and heavy cavalry. It really caused a mini revolution within the military tactics of Europe at the time, where everyone went, oh my god, how do we stop this? And they had to rethink their tactics, because everyone had got used to the idea of heavy cavalry and lances and cavalry charge being a thing of the past. They were used to pike and shot and the carousel tactics and the occasional heavy cavalry, not shot cavalry doing a full frontal charge. And due to this, the Winged Hussars were very successful, in part due to the fact that they kept old tactics and simply updated them rather than completely scrapped them like the rest of Europe had. And overall they were very, very effective as a unit. So yeah, if you'd been on a battlefield in the 1600s, there's a good chance you would have seen heavy cavalry wearing what seemed to be knight armour charging in, dual-wielding pistols, if cowboys and knights had a baby. Which is a weird image, but I cannot wait for someone to make a film about it, as the action scenes in that will be very cool. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos, and drop a comment down below, let me know what you thought. And please share this with any of your friends who you think would find this interesting. Thank you.